Close your eyes and let your mind drift. Drift back through the sands of time, where the golden sun meets the eternal waters of the Nile. Feel the warm breeze carrying whispers of ancient magic, of a civilization that touched the very stars themselves. There, in the shimmering heat of Egypt, where pyramids cast long shadows across endless desert, lived a woman whose name would echo through eternity. Her voice could charm serpents, her mind could outwit emperors, and her beauty was said to launch 1,000 ships and topple the mightiest of empires. Her name was Cleopatra, the last queen of the Nile. But before we begin this journey through her extraordinary life, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment below and tell us what other fascinating stories from history you'd love to hear whispered into the night. Your dreams might just inspire our next tale. Now, dim the lights around you. Let the world fade away. Close your eyes and simply listen. Let the gentle rhythm of the Nile carry you back to a time when gods walked among mortals, when love could change the course of history, and when one woman's ambition could shake the very foundations of the world. The story begins. In the year 69 before the birth of Christ, when the world was young and empires rose and fell like the morning mist, the Nile sang its ancient song. Listen. Can you hear it? The gentle lapping of water against the marble steps of Alexandria, where the great lighthouse stood like a beacon between earth and heaven. It was here, in this jewel of the Mediterranean, that a child was born, whose destiny would intertwine with the very flow of that sacred river. The palace of the Ptolemies hummed with anticipation as servants moved like shadows through corridors adorned with gold and lapis lazuli. The air was thick with frankincense and myrrh, with the weight of centuries and the promise of tomorrow. Cleopatra sat seventh. Cleopatra drew her first breath in chambers where the wisdom of ages seemed to whisper from every stone. The great library of Alexandria cast its shadow over her cradle, and perhaps even then knowledge itself seemed to bend toward this tiny princess whose eyes would soon reflect the depths of the Nile. Her father, Ptolemy XV, held her in arms that had known both crown and exile. The bloodline of Alexander's general Ptolemy V flowed through her veins, carrying with it the dreams of Macedonia and the magic of Egypt. She was Greek by blood, but Egypt would claim her soul, molding her into something the world had never seen, a pharaoh who would speak 9 languages, who would read the ancient texts in their original tongues, who would become the voice of a civilization older than memory. The palace where she spent her childhood was a world unto itself. Imagine walking through its halls, your bare feet cool against marble floors that had been walked by scholars and kings. The walls told stories in hieroglyphs and Greek inscriptions, a testament to the unique fusion that was Ptolemaic Egypt. In the gardens, lotus flowers bloomed in pools that reflected the infinite sky, while papyrus reeds swayed in the gentle breeze that carried the scent of the river. Even as a child, Cleopatra moved through this world with an awareness that set her apart. While other children played with dolls of clay and wood, she was drawn to the scrolls in the library, to the conversations of visiting philosophers, to the maps that showed the vast expanse of the known world. Her tutors, the finest minds that gold could summon, spoke of her in hushed tones. Here was a mind that absorbed knowledge like the desert absorbed rain, completely, desperately, transforming it into something vital. The Nile itself seemed to recognize her as its own. In the evenings, when the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, young Cleopatra would stand on the palace balconies, watching the sacred river flow past. The water carried the hopes and dreams of millions, the silt that would feed the land, the stories of gods and mortals that had played out along its banks for thousands of years. In those quiet moments, with the river's song in her ears and the weight of destiny on her young shoulders, Cleopatra began to understand that she was not merely a princess, she was the living embodiment of Egypt itself. The river that gave life to the desert, the bridge between the ancient world and the new, the last flame of a civilization that had illuminated humanity's path for millennia. The palace priests would whisper that she was chosen by Isis, the mother goddess whose tears had swollen the Nile since time immemorial. Whether this was true or merely the hope of a people who sensed that their world was changing, Cleopatra felt the weight of their belief. She was being prepared not just to rule, but to become the voice of Egypt in a world where Rome's shadow grew longer with each passing day. As she grew, so did her understanding of the delicate balance her kingdom maintained. Egypt was wealthy beyond measure, its grain feeding the Mediterranean world, its gold filling the treasuries of allied kingdoms. But wealth, she learned, was both shield and target. The Romans, those efficient and ambitious people from across the sea, looked upon Egypt with eyes that calculated profit and loss, that saw opportunity in every sign of weakness. But tonight, in this moment suspended between past and future, Cleopatra was still a child of the Nile, absorbing its wisdom, learning its secrets, preparing for a destiny that would require her to be goddess, queen, lover, and legend all at once. The river flowed on as it always had, as it always would, carrying her toward a future that would test every lesson learned in these peaceful palace halls. The death of a pharaoh is not merely the end of a life. It is the moment when the very fabric of reality shifts, when the gods themselves hold their breath and wait to see who will carry the sacred burden forward. In the year 51 before Christ, when Cleopatra was barely 18 summers old, that moment arrived like a storm across the desert. Ptolemy XV, her father, had felt the weight of mortality pressing upon him like the stones of the pyramids. In his final days, as the palace filled with the scent of burning herbs and the soft chanting of priests, he called his daughter to his side. The chamber was dimly lit by oil lamps that flickered like dying stars, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the whisper of papyrus in the wind, "you must remember that we are not merely rulers of Egypt. We are Egypt itself. The Nile flows in our veins, the desert wind carries our breath, and the sun rises and sets by our command. But the world beyond our borders grows restless." Cleopatra knelt beside his bed, her young hand clasping his aged fingers. In that touch, she felt the transfer of something more than earthly power. The wisdom of the ages, the responsibility for millions of souls, the terrible and beautiful burden of being the last of her line, all of it flowed between them like the sacred waters of the Nile. When the great king drew his final breath, the ritual of succession began. But this was no ordinary ascension. According to the ancient laws and the will of the gods, Cleopatra would not rule alone. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XV, barely 10 years old, would be her co-ruler, and as was the custom of their house, her husband. The thought sat heavy in her heart like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that would reach far into the future. The coronation ceremony unfolded like a dream woven from gold and incense. In the great temple of Ptah in Memphis, where the pharaohs of Egypt had been crowned for over 3 millennia, Cleopatra stood before the assembled priests and nobles. The ancient words of consecration echoed through the chamber, spoken in the language of the gods themselves. Upon her head they placed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the sacred Uraeus serpent coiled at her brow, ready to strike down any who would threaten the divine order. But even in that moment of triumph, Cleopatra felt the shadows gathering. The Roman Republic, that great and terrible machine of conquest, had been Egypt's reluctant protector and eager creditor. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, those titans of the northern world, cast their influences like nets across the Mediterranean. Egypt's wealth had funded their wars, and now they expected their due. The young queen understood what many of her advisors refused to acknowledge, that Egypt's independence hung by a thread as fine as spider silk. The old ways, the comfortable traditions of Ptolemaic rule, were luxuries she could no longer afford. She needed to be more than a pharaoh. She needed to be a force of nature, a woman who could stand as equal to the greatest men of her age. In the palace at Alexandria, where the great lighthouse sent its beam across the dark waters, Cleopatra began to transform herself. She studied not just the ancient texts, but the dispatches from Rome, the reports from her spies, the whispered conversations of merchants who had seen the world beyond Egypt's borders. She learned the art of war alongside the art of peace, understanding that a queen who could not command armies was a queen who would not long command anything. Her brother husband, Ptolemy III, remained a child, content to play with toy soldiers while real armies gathered on the horizon. But his advisors, led by the cunning eunuch Pothinus, saw in the boy's youth an opportunity. They whispered in his ear that he was the true pharaoh, that his sister was merely a woman who had forgotten her place. The palace began to divide, like a great ship breaking apart in a storm. The tension between the siblings grew like the summer heat, oppressive and inescapable. Cleopatra found herself increasingly isolated, her supporters melting away like morning mist as Ptolemy III's faction grew bolder. They controlled the army, they controlled the treasury, and most dangerously, they controlled the boy king who bore the divine right to rule. In the third year of their joint reign, the inevitable happened. The advisors of Ptolemy III moved openly against Cleopatra, forcing her to flee Alexandria in the dark of night. As her ship sailed away from the harbor, she stood at the stern, watching the lighthouse fade into the distance. The light that had guided ships safely to shore for centuries now seemed to mock her, a beacon she could see but not reach. But Cleopatra was her father's daughter, and more than that, she was the daughter of the Nile itself. Exile was not defeat. It was merely the first movement in a symphony that would reshape the world. In the darkness of that night, as her ship carried her away from everything she had known, she began to plan her return. The river would flow again in her favor. The gods had not abandoned her. They had merely set her on a longer path, one that would require her to become something greater than any pharaoh who had come before. The weight of the crown might have been taken from her head, but the weight of destiny still pressed upon her heart, and in the distance, across the Mediterranean, the drums of Roman civil war were beginning to beat. Exile tastes like bitter honey on the tongue, sweet with the memory of what was lost, sharp with the promise of what might yet be won. In the harsh lands beyond Egypt's borders, where the sun beat down mercilessly and the sand stung like tiny daggers, Cleopatra learned the true meaning of hunger. Not the hunger of the body, though she knew that too, but the hunger of the soul, the desperate need to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The year was 48 before Christ, and the world itself seemed to be tearing apart at the seams. From her exile in Syria, where she had gathered what loyal forces she could muster, Cleopatra watched as the Roman Republic devoured itself in civil war. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies, now circled each other like lions in the arena, their conflict sending ripples across every corner of the known world. In the camps of her small army, huddled around fires that provided little warmth in the cold desert night, Cleopatra's advisors spoke in hushed tones of the impossibility of their situation. Ptolemy III controlled Egypt's vast resources, commanded the loyalty of the army, and had the backing of Rome's Egyptian allies. What could one exiled queen do against such overwhelming odds? But Cleopatra had learned something in exile that no palace education could have taught her, the art of seeing opportunity where others saw only disaster. As reports reached her of Caesar's victories in Gaul, of Pompey's retreat toward Egypt, she began to understand that the greatest gamble of her life lay before her. The Roman civil war was not just a distant conflict, it was the key to her restoration. The news came like lightning across the desert. Pompey the Great, defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus, was fleeing toward Egypt with the remnants of his fleet. The advisors of Ptolemy III, those cunning men who had orchestrated her exile, saw this as their moment to curry favor with what they believed would be the winning side. They would welcome Pompey, offer him sanctuary, and bind Egypt to his cause. But Cleopatra, studying the situation like a chess master, contemplating her next move, saw the fatal flaw in their reasoning. Pompey was not fleeing as a conqueror seeking allies. He was fleeing as a defeated man seeking refuge. Caesar, relentless and brilliant, would not be far behind. And when Caesar arrived in Egypt, he would find either a kingdom that had sheltered his greatest enemy, or a kingdom that had demonstrated its loyalty to Rome's new master. The decision that followed would have tested the nerve of Hannibal himself. Cleopatra chose to make her own approach to Caesar, but not as a suppliant begging for mercy. She would come as a pharaoh offering partnership, as a queen who understood the changing tides of power and was willing to swim with them rather than against them. The logistics of her plan were worthy of a military campaign. She could not simply sail into Alexandria's harbor. Her brother's forces would capture or kill her before she could take a single step on Egyptian soil. Instead, she would need to reach Caesar himself, to present her case directly to the man who now held the power to reshape the world. The opportunity came when Caesar, pursuing Pompey, landed in Alexandria with a small force. The city that had once been Cleopatra's home was now enemy territory, but it was also the place where she might reclaim her throne. The plan that emerged from her desperate imagination was so audacious that it seemed born from the mind of a goddess rather than a mortal woman. A trusted servant, a man named Apollodorus who had served her family for decades, would carry her into the very heart of the palace. Not as a queen in royal regalia, but hidden within a bundle of linens, like a precious cargo being delivered to Caesar's quarters. The risk was absolute. If they were discovered, death would be swift and certain. But the alternative was to remain in exile while her kingdom slipped away like sand through an hourglass. The night of her return was moonless, as if the gods themselves had drawn a veil across the sky to hide her approach. Apollodorus, his face grim with the weight of what they were attempting, carried his precious burden through the palace corridors where Cleopatra had once walked as a child. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every sound might herald discovery. When they reached Caesar's chambers, the moment of truth arrived. The guards, accustomed to the comings and goings of merchants and tribute-bearers, barely glanced at the servant with his bundle of fine linens. Inside, Caesar, that master of the world who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon, waited unknowingly for an encounter that would change the course of history. The bundle was unrolled, and like Aphrodite rising from the foam, Cleopatra emerged before the most powerful man in the world. But this was no mere theatrical gesture. In that moment, she was gambling everything on her ability to convince Caesar that she was not just another client ruler seeking his favor, but a partner worthy of his respect and alliance. The conversation that followed, conducted in the flickering light of oil lamps, while the Mediterranean wind whispered through the palace windows, would determine the fate of Egypt and perhaps the fate of the world itself. Two of history's greatest figures, meeting for the first time in circumstances that would have seemed impossible to any playwright, began to weave the threads of a story that would echo through the ages. Caesar, hardened by years of war and politics, found himself face to face with a woman who was everything he had not expected. Intelligent, cultured, beautiful, yes, but more than that, a mind that could match his own in its scope and ambition. And Cleopatra, the exiled queen who had risked everything on this single throw of the dice, began to understand that she had found not just a potential ally, but perhaps the one man in the world who could truly understand the weight of the crown she sought to reclaim. The serpent had made her gamble. Now the world would discover what she had won. In the soft light of dawn that filtered through the palace windows, two of history's most extraordinary minds sat across from each other like players in a cosmic game of chess. Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the man who had crossed the Rubicon and shattered the Roman Republic, found himself studying a woman who defied every expectation he had formed of Egyptian royalty. Cleopatra had not come to him as a suppliant, despite her desperate circumstances. She sat with the bearing of a pharaoh, her dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. When she spoke, it was not in the broken Latin of a provincial ruler, but in the pure, cultured tones of someone who had been educated in the greatest library the world had ever known. "Caesar," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, "I have not come to beg for your mercy. I have come to offer you something far more valuable than gold or grain. I offer you Egypt itself, not as a conquered province, but as a willing partner in the new world you are creating." The Roman general, accustomed to the fawning of kings and the desperation of the defeated, found himself intrigued by this woman who spoke of partnership rather than submission. Around them, the palace hummed with the nervous energy of servants who sensed that something momentous was occurring in their midst. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria pursuing Pompey, but fate had delivered him something far more complex than a simple military campaign. The advisors of Ptolemy III had indeed welcomed Pompey, but only long enough to murder him, presenting Caesar with his enemy's severed head as a grotesque gift. The gesture had disgusted Caesar, who had hoped to show clemency to his former ally. Now he found himself in a kingdom ruled by regicides, dealing with a boy king he could not respect and a deposed queen who commanded his attention. The days that followed were like a careful dance between two masters of the art of power. Caesar, though he commanded legions, was far from Rome with only a small force. He needed Egypt's resources, its grain, its wealth, but more than that, he needed stability in this crucial corner of his growing empire. Cleopatra, despite her exile, understood Egypt as no Roman ever could. She knew its people, its priests, its ancient rhythms that had sustained civilization when Rome was still a collection of mud huts on 7 hills. In the great hall of the palace, where Alexander the Great had once held court, they met with the boy king Ptolemy III and his advisors. The contrast could not have been starker. On one side, a child manipulated by cunning but short-sighted counselors. On the other, a woman who had already proven her courage and intelligence by the very fact of her presence. The negotiations that followed were conducted with the elaborate courtesy of ancient diplomacy, but underneath the formal language lay currents of tension that could reshape the Mediterranean world. Caesar, with his characteristic directness, proposed a solution that honored both Roman interests and Egyptian law. The siblings would rule jointly, as their father had intended, but under Roman protection. But Ptolemy III's advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus, had underestimated both Caesar's determination and Cleopatra's resilience. They had expected the Roman to ratify their puppet's rule and depart with his tribute. Instead, they found themselves facing a general who had decided that Egypt's future lay not with a malleable boy, but with a woman who could be both ally and equal. The boy king's faction, growing desperate, began to plot against Caesar himself. They had killed one Roman commander, perhaps they could kill another. But they had forgotten that Caesar was not merely a politician, he was a military genius who had survived the treacherous politics of Rome and the brutal campaigns of Gaul. Their conspiracy, born of desperation and nurtured by arrogance, would be their undoing. The crisis came to a head when the royal fleet, loyal to Ptolemy III, attempted to trap Caesar in Alexandria's harbor. The Roman general, faced with the possibility of being besieged in the very city where he had come to impose order, made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than retreat, he would fight, and he would fight with Cleopatra as his ally. The Battle of Alexandria was not merely a conflict between Roman and Egyptian forces, it was a battle for the soul of Egypt itself. On one side fought the forces of the old order, the nobles and priests who saw in the boy king a return to the comfortable traditions of Ptolemaic rule. On the other side stood Caesar's legions, but more importantly, they stood with Cleopatra, the queen who had dared to dream of a different future. The fighting raged through the streets of the great city, past the tomb of Alexander, around the base of the lighthouse that had guided ships to safety for centuries. Citizens barricaded themselves in their homes, while the fate of their kingdom was decided by sword and spear. The great library, repository of human knowledge, trembled as the sounds of battle echoed through its hallowed halls. But it was not just military might that decided the outcome. Throughout the city, word spread that Cleopatra had returned, that the rightful pharaoh was fighting for her throne. The people of Alexandria, who had known prosperity under her father's rule, began to remember what they had lost in the chaos of civil war. Support for the boy king, always tenuous, began to crumble like sand in the wind. The end came swiftly. Ptolemy III, attempting to flee the city by ship, was betrayed by his own supporters. The crown that had been torn from Cleopatra's head was placed there once again, but now it rested on a woman who had been tested by exile, tempered by desperation, and forged into something harder than bronze in the furnace of her struggle. As the sun set over Alexandria's harbour, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, Caesar and Cleopatra stood together on the palace balcony where she had dreamed as a child. The game of power had been played, and both had emerged victorious. He with a secure ally in the east, she with a throne reclaimed and a partnership that would reshape the world. But in the shadows of that victory, new challenges were already stirring. Rome had not yet fully accepted Caesar's supremacy, and there were those who would see his alliance with an Egyptian queen as a betrayal of Roman values. The dance of power had ended one movement, but the symphony was far from over. The Nile flowed on as it always had, carrying the dreams of pharaohs and the ambitions of emperors toward an uncertain future. Love, when it comes to those who hold the fate of nations in their hands, is never a simple thing. It carries with it the weight of kingdoms, the whispers of gods, and the judgment of history. In the months following Caesar's victory in Alexandria, as the Mediterranean world watched with fascination and fear, something extraordinary began to bloom between the Roman conqueror and the Egyptian queen. The palace at Alexandria, which had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, now became the stage for a romance that would echo through the ages. But this was no mere dalliance between a powerful man and a beautiful woman. This was the meeting of two minds that had been shaped by greatness, two souls who understood that their personal desires could reshape the very foundations of civilization. Caesar, now in his 50s, had known many women, Roman matrons who played the game of politics with skill and calculation, Celtic queens who had fought against his legions with fierce courage, courtesans who offered pleasure without complication. But in Cleopatra, he found something that had eluded him throughout his meteoric rise, an equal. A woman who could discuss philosophy with the wisdom of Athens, strategy with the insight of Alexander, and poetry with the passion of Sappho. For Cleopatra, Caesar represented something equally rare, a man who saw in her not just a beautiful face or a useful ally, but a partner worthy of his respect. In the evenings, when the palace grew quiet and the Mediterranean breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the courtyards, they would walk together through the gardens, where the pharaohs had contemplated the mysteries of existence. Their conversations ranged from the practical matters of governance to the deepest questions of philosophy, from the movement of the stars to the dreams of mortals. It was during one of these evening walks that Caesar proposed something that would scandalize Rome and delight Egypt, a voyage up the Nile, a journey into the heart of the kingdom that would soon be his responsibility to protect. But this would be no ordinary expedition. This would be a floating palace, a demonstration of power and magnificence that would remind every village and city along the sacred river that their queen had returned in triumph. The barge that was constructed for this journey was a marvel that seemed to have sailed straight from the realm of the gods. Nearly 400 feet long, it was essentially a floating palace, with rooms panelled in cedar and cypress, floors of marble and alabaster, and gardens that bloomed with flowers from every corner of the known world. The great cabin where Caesar and Cleopatra would reside was decorated with gold and precious stones, its walls painted with scenes from Egyptian mythology that told the story of gods and mortals learning to love. As the magnificent vessel began its stately progress up the Nile, followed by a fleet of supply ships and guard vessels, the people of Egypt lined the banks to witness something unprecedented. Here was their pharaoh, the living goddess, traveling with the most powerful man in the world. Here was proof that Egypt had not fallen to Roman conquest, but had risen to Roman partnership. The journey itself was like a dream made manifest. At Memphis, the ancient capital where the pharaohs had been crowned since time immemorial, Caesar walked among the ruins of monuments that had been ancient when Rome was young. Cleopatra, seeing the wonder in his eyes, began to understand that she possessed something he could never conquer, the magic of Egypt itself, the mystery of a civilization that had touched the infinite. At Thebes, they visited the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, where the priests conducted ceremonies that had been performed for millennia. Caesar, accustomed to the practical gods of Rome, found himself moved by the profound spirituality of Egyptian religion. Here divinity was not distant and abstract, but present in every stone, every hieroglyph, every ritual that connected the living with the eternal. But it was at the first cataract, where the Nile tumbled over granite boulders in a display of raw power, that the most significant moment of their journey occurred. Standing at the edge of the known world, where Egypt met Nubia and the river disappeared into the mysterious heart of Africa, Caesar and Cleopatra made promises that would bind their futures together. The child that was conceived during this golden voyage would be born 9 months later, a son who would carry in his blood the legacy of both Rome and Egypt. Caesarion, as he would be called, would represent the possibility of a new kind of empire, one that combined Roman strength with Egyptian wisdom, Western pragmatism with Eastern mysticism. But even as they celebrated their love and planned their future, the seeds of tragedy were already being sown. In Rome, Caesar's enemies gathered like vultures, whispering that their great leader had been seduced by an Eastern sorceress, that he had forgotten his Roman virtue in the perfumed chambers of an Egyptian palace. The very magnificence of their journey, the open display of their partnership, would provide ammunition for those who sought to destroy them both. News from the capital grew increasingly ominous. The Roman Senate, jealous of Caesar's power and suspicious of his intentions, began to speak of him as a man who had abandoned his Roman identity. The sight of their supreme commander traveling in luxury with a foreign queen, displaying the wealth and sophistication of Egypt while Rome itself struggled with civil war, created a political crisis that would soon demand resolution. As the golden barge made its way back toward Alexandria, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of two people who had dared to love across the boundaries of empire, the future hung in the balance like a sword suspended by a thread. The voyage that had begun as a celebration of triumph and partnership was ending with the shadow of destiny falling across their path. The Nile, eternal and unchanging, had carried them toward a reckoning that would test not only their love, but the very foundations of the world they were trying to build together. In the distance, Rome waited with its cold marble halls and its hungry ambitions, while Egypt dreamed of a future that might never come to pass. The Golden Voyage was ending, but the story it had begun would continue to unfold in ways that neither Caesar nor Cleopatra could have imagined, carrying them toward a destiny that would make them legends, and perhaps ultimately martyrs to the dream of a world united by love rather than divided by conquest. The winter of 44 before Christ settled over Rome like a shroud, bringing with it whispers that echoed through the marble halls of the Forum and the shadowed alcoves of the Senate House. Caesar had returned from Egypt, but he had not returned alone. The city that had once welcomed its greatest general as a conquering hero now watched with uneasy eyes as he established Cleopatra in a villa across the Tiber, as if she were not merely a foreign queen, but a partner in the grand design of empire. The villa that became Cleopatra's Roman residence was itself a statement of defiance. Built in the Egyptian style, with columns that recalled the temples of Luxor and gardens that bloomed with lotus flowers, it stood as a piece of Alexandria, transplanted to the heart of the Roman world. Here, surrounded by scholars and artists she had brought from her homeland, the Queen of Egypt held court as if she were still in her palace by the Nile. But Rome was not Alexandria, and the Roman people were not Egyptians. The city that had conquered the world through discipline and virtue watched with growing alarm as their leader seemed to adopt the customs and perhaps the ambitions of an Eastern monarch. When Caesar placed a golden statue of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genetrix, claiming divine ancestry for his Egyptian lover, the whispers became murmurs, and the murmurs became dangerous talk. In the villa by the Tiber, Cleopatra felt the weight of Roman disapproval, like a physical presence. She had come to Rome not as a suppliant, but as a queen, bringing with her the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. She had expected to find a city worthy of Caesar's greatness, but instead she found a place that seemed almost provincial compared to the cosmopolitan magnificence of Alexandria. The Romans, she discovered, were a practical people, suspicious of beauty for its own sake, distrustful of luxury, committed to a vision of virtue that seemed to exclude the very qualities that made life worth living. They looked at her entourage of scholars and artists, her retinue of beautiful servants, her collection of rare books and precious objects, and saw not refinement, but corruption. Yet there were those in Rome who recognized her worth. The great orator Cicero, despite his political opposition to Caesar, found himself grudgingly impressed by Cleopatra's intelligence and learning. Young nobles who had grown tired of Roman austerity gathered in her salon, drawn by conversations that ranged from poetry to philosophy, from mathematics to music. She became, almost despite herself, the center of a cultural revolution that challenged traditional Roman values. But it was Caesar's own behavior that provided the most ammunition for his enemies. The man who had once been content with Roman citizenship now seemed to aspire to something greater and something more dangerous. He had been declared dictator for life, a title that sat uneasily with Romans who still remembered the Republic. When he appeared in public, wearing the purple of royalty, when he allowed himself to be addressed with divine honors, when he spoke of plans that would transform the Mediterranean world into a vast empire ruled from Rome but influenced by Egyptian wisdom, the final elements of conspiracy began to coalesce. The plot that formed against Caesar was driven by more than political ambition. It was fueled by a profound cultural fear. The conspirators, led by men like Brutus and Cassius, saw in Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra not just a personal scandal, but a threat to the very essence of Roman identity. They spoke of restoring the Republic, but what they really sought to restore was a world where Rome remained Roman, where foreign influences were kept at bay, where the ancient virtues of their ancestors were preserved against the seductive corruption of the East. The omens began to appear in the early days of March. Soothsayers spoke of dreams and portents, of sacrificial animals with deformed livers, of birds that flew in ominous patterns across the Roman sky. The priests of various temples reported strange occurrences, statues that wept, altars that spontaneously caught fire, ceremonies that went awry despite meticulous preparation. Cleopatra, trained in the mystical traditions of Egypt, understood the language of omens better than most. She had learned to read the signs in the flight of ibises along the Nile, in the patterns of flood and drought, in the movement of the stars across the desert sky. The portents she saw in Rome filled her with a dread that grew stronger with each passing day. She begged Caesar to be cautious, to postpone his public appearances, to strengthen his guard against the forces that seemed to be gathering in the shadows. But Caesar, the man who had crossed the Rubicon and conquered Gaul, who had faced death 1,000 times in battle, refused to live in fear of whispers and shadows. He had become perhaps too accustomed to his own invincibility, too confident in his ability to outmaneuver any threat. The morning of March 15th dawned cold and grey, as if the very sky were mourning what was about to unfold. In her villa across the Tiber, Cleopatra woke with a sense of foreboding that seemed to press against her heart like a physical weight. She sent messengers to Caesar, urging him to stay home, to avoid the Senate meeting that had been called for that day. But Caesar, who had survived the politics of Rome and the battlefields of Gaul, who had made kings of enemies and allies of strangers, dismissed her fears as the natural anxiety of a woman who loved him. He kissed her farewell in the grey morning light, promising to return before evening with news of his plans for the campaign against Parthia, the great war that would unite East and West under Roman eagles. The Senate house of Pompey, where the meeting was to be held, stood like a tomb in the morning mist. Caesar arrived with his usual confidence, his toga draped in the manner of a man accustomed to command, his bearing that of someone who had never doubted his own destiny. The senators gathered around him with smiles and courteous words, and for a moment it seemed that all the omens and warnings had been merely the product of overwrought imagination. Then, in a moment that would echo through eternity, the knives came out. 23 wounds they gave him, these men who claimed to love the Republic more than they loved the man who had made them great. As Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood staining the marble floor where so many great speeches had been delivered, the conspirators stood over his body, believing they had saved Rome from tyranny. But across the Tiber, in a villa decorated with lotus flowers and filled with the wisdom of Egypt, Cleopatra felt the moment of his death like a sword thrust through her own heart. The connection that had bound them, forged in the palace at Alexandria and strengthened during their golden voyage up the Nile, was severed in an instant, leaving her alone in a world that had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous. The news came to her not through official messengers, but through the whispered words of servants, the frightened faces of her guards, the sudden silence that fell over the city like a pall. Caesar was dead, murdered by men who called themselves patriots, and with his death the protection that had sheltered her in Rome vanished like morning mist before the sun. In that moment of devastating loss, Cleopatra understood that she was no longer the partner of Rome's master, but a foreign queen whose very presence had become a symbol of everything the conspirators sought to destroy. The golden age that she and Caesar had dreamed of, the vision of an empire that combined Roman strength with Egyptian wisdom, had died with him on the Senate House floor. But even in her grief, even as she felt the foundations of her world crumbling beneath her feet, Cleopatra began to plan. She was the daughter of the Nile, the heir to 3 millennia of Egyptian survival, and she would not allow Caesar's death to become her own destruction. The game of power was not over. It had merely entered a new and more dangerous phase. As night fell over Rome and the conspirators celebrated their victory with wine and self-congratulation, Cleopatra gathered her most trusted advisors and began to prepare for the long journey home. Egypt was calling to her across the wine-dark sea, promising sanctuary and the chance to rebuild what had been lost. The Ides of March had claimed the greatest Roman of his age, but they had not claimed the Queen of Egypt. In the darkness of that terrible night, as she prepared to flee a city that had become hostile to everything she represented, Cleopatra carried with her not just grief for a lost love, but the seeds of a new chapter in the eternal story of Egypt's struggle for independence. The river would welcome her home, and in its eternal flow she would find the strength to face whatever trials lay ahead. The ship that carried Cleopatra away from Rome sailed through waters dark as spilled wine, bearing not just a queen in flight, but the shattered remnants of a dream that had promised to unite the world. Behind her lay the eternal city, now convulsed with civil war as Caesar's lieutenants and his assassins struggled for control of his legacy. Ahead lay Egypt, her sanctuary and her kingdom, where the Nile waited with its ancient promise of renewal. The voyage across the Mediterranean was a journey through memory as much as distance. Standing at the bow of her ship, watching the stars that had guided Egyptian navigators for thousands of years, Cleopatra felt the weight of all that had been lost. Caesar was dead, their son Caesarion was fatherless, and the golden alliance that had seemed destined to reshape the world had been murdered along with the man who had made it possible. But grief, she had learned, was a luxury that queens could rarely afford. Even as her heart ached with loss, her mind worked with the cold precision of a pharaoh who understood that survival required more than tears. Caesar's death had not just taken her lover. It had eliminated Egypt's most powerful protector in a world where Rome's appetite for conquest had only grown stronger with each passing year. When the lighthouse of Alexandria appeared on the horizon, its beacon cutting through the darkness like a sword of light, Cleopatra felt the first stirrings of hope she had known since that terrible morning in Rome. This was her city, built by her ancestors, filled with her people, defended by armies that knew her not as a foreign curiosity, but as their rightful queen. Here, if anywhere, she could build the strength necessary to secure Egypt's future. The welcome that greeted her return was like balm for wounds that had seemed beyond healing. The people of Alexandria lined the harbor, their voices raised in songs of celebration that echoed off the water like prayers made manifest. Priests from every temple in the city came to bless her homecoming, their ceremonies invoking the protection of gods who had watched over Egypt since the dawn of time. But even as she accepted the homage of her subjects, Cleopatra's thoughts were already turning to the challenges that lay ahead. Rome's civil war was far from over, and the eventual victor would inherit not just Caesar's power, but his interest in Egypt's wealth. She needed to choose the winning side before the war's outcome became clear. needed to forge new alliances that would protect her kingdom regardless of who ultimately claimed the purple. The palace at Alexandria, which had once seemed like a prison during her youth, now felt like a fortress. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of the great library, attended by counselors who understood the subtle art of Egyptian diplomacy, she began to rebuild not just her own position, but the foundation of Egypt's independence. The child Caesarion, now 3 years old, became both her greatest joy and her most dangerous gamble. In his dark eyes she could see the echo of his father's intelligence. In his imperious gestures, the echo of royal blood that flowed from both Rome and Egypt. He was living proof of the alliance that had died with Caesar, but he was also a potential threat to any Roman leader who saw in him a rival claim to power. The reports that reached Alexandria from Rome painted a picture of chaos that would have been comic if the stakes had not been so desperately high. Caesar's assassins, who had expected to be hailed as liberators, found themselves reviled by a population that had loved their victim. His lieutenant, Mark Antony, had seized control of the city and was systematically hunting down the conspirators. His adopted son, Octavian, barely 19 years old, had arrived from his studies to claim his inheritance and was proving to have more steel in his spine than anyone had expected. From her palace by the Nile, Cleopatra watched these developments with the calculating eye of a pharaoh who had learned that survival often depended on backing the right horse in someone else's race. The conspirators were clearly doomed. They had acted without understanding the mood of the Roman people or the loyalty of Caesar's legions. The real question was whether Antony or Octavian would emerge victorious from the struggle for Caesar's legacy. The answer came sooner than she had expected. The two men, along with a third general named Lepidus, formed an unlikely alliance called the Second Triumvirate, dividing the Roman world among themselves and turning their combined fury against Caesar's killers. The proscription lists that followed made the streets of Rome run red with blood as the triumvirs eliminated their enemies and seized their property to fund the coming war. For Cleopatra, this development created both opportunity and danger. The triumvirate needed Egypt's grain to feed their armies, Egypt's gold to pay their soldiers, Egypt's ships to transport their legions. But they also remembered that Egypt had been Caesar's lover as much as his ally, and they could not be certain where her true loyalties lay. The test of those loyalties came when Cassius, one of Caesar's principal assassins, arrived in Syria and demanded that Egypt provide him with ships and supplies for his campaign against the triumvirate. Here was the moment of decision that would determine Egypt's fate: support Caesar's murderers and risk the wrath of his successors, or refuse and face immediate invasion by forces already positioned on Egypt's borders. Cleopatra's response was a masterpiece of diplomatic cunning. She sent the requested ships, but manned with crews loyal to her, carrying supplies that would mysteriously spoil before reaching their destination, sailing by routes that would ensure they arrived too late to affect the outcome of any battle. She appeared to comply with Cassius's demands while actually ensuring his failure, gambling that the triumvirate would prove stronger than Caesar's assassins. The gamble paid off magnificently. At the Battle of Philippi, in the fields where Alexander's father had once won his greatest victory, the armies of the triumvirate crushed the forces of Brutus and Cassius. The Republic's last defenders died by their own swords rather than face capture, and with their deaths the old order that had ruled Rome for 5 centuries breathed its last. But victory brought new challenges. The triumvirate, having eliminated their common enemies, began to eye each other with growing suspicion. The Roman world was divided among them like spoils of war. Octavian took the west, Lepidus received Africa, and Mark Antony claimed dominion over the east, including the responsibility for managing Rome's relationship with Egypt. As reports reached Alexandria describing Antony's sumptuous lifestyle in Athens, his grand ambitions for the eastern provinces, his reputation as both a brilliant general and a notorious lover of luxury, Cleopatra began to understand that her greatest test was still ahead. This man, who now held power over her kingdom's fate, was cut from very different cloth than Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculating and controlled, Antony was passionate and impulsive. Where Caesar had sought power for its own sake, Antony seemed to seek it for the pleasures it could provide. The summons, when it came, was both expected and ominous. Mark Antony, now master of the Roman East, requested the pleasure of Queen Cleopatra's company at Tarsus, where they might discuss the future relationship between Rome and Egypt. The message was politely worded, but its meaning was clear. The new dispensation required new alliances, and Egypt's queen would need to prove her worth to a man who had never felt Caesar's fascination with her kingdom's ancient wisdom. As Cleopatra began to plan her journey to Tarsus, she knew that she was preparing for perhaps the most important performance of her life. The meeting with Caesar had been born from desperation and nurtured by genuine affection. This encounter would require her to seduce not just a man, but a vision of the future. To convince Antony that Egypt could be more than a source of tribute, it could be the foundation of an empire that would dwarf even Alexander's conquests. The Nile had carried her home to safety, but now it would carry her toward a destiny that would determine whether the land of the pharaohs would survive as an independent kingdom or become merely another province in Rome's vast empire. The river flowed on, eternal and unchanging, carrying the dreams of queens toward whatever fate awaited them in the meeting of East and West. The summer heat lay heavy on the waters of the Cydnus River as the city of Tarsus prepared for a spectacle unlike any it had ever witnessed. Mark Antony, master of the Roman East, had established his court in this ancient city where East met West, where the wisdom of Asia had mingled with the power of Rome since the days of Alexander. But nothing in Tarsus's long history had prepared it for what was about to unfold upon its waters. Cleopatra understood that this meeting would determine not just her own fate, but the future of Egypt itself. Antony was not Caesar. He lacked that great man's intellectual refinement, his appreciation for the subtler arts of power. But he possessed something that might prove even more valuable, a hunger for glory that burned like a flame in the darkness, a vision of greatness that could be shaped by a woman who understood the desires of his heart. The barge that she commissioned for this encounter was designed to be more than transportation. It was to be a floating dream, a vision of paradise made manifest on the waters of the world. For months, the finest craftsmen in Egypt had labored to create something that would surpass even the golden vessel that had carried her and Caesar up the Nile. This would be Aphrodite's own ship, carrying the goddess of love to her meeting with Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. The vessel that finally emerged from the shipyards of Alexandria was a masterpiece that seemed to have sailed from the realm of the gods themselves. The hull was gilded with gold that caught the sunlight like captured fire. The sails were made of purple silk that billowed in the wind like the robes of divinity, and the silver oars flashed in perfect rhythm as they cut through the water. The stern was carved in the shape of a great lotus blossom sacred to Isis, while the prow bore the head of Sobek, the crocodile god who protected those who traveled the waters of Egypt. But it was the figure at the heart of this floating palace that transformed spectacle into magic. Cleopatra had chosen to appear not as an Egyptian queen, but as Aphrodite herself, the goddess who had risen from the foam of the sea to bring love and beauty to the world. Her costume was a masterpiece of illusion, cloth of gold that seemed to flow like liquid metal, jewelry that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns, a crown that suggested divinity without claiming it outright. Around her, the deck of the barge had been transformed into a scene from the most beautiful myths ever told. Boys dressed as cupids fanned her with peacock feathers, while women costumed as sea nymphs played harps and lyres whose music drifted across the water like the singing of sirens. Flowers had been scattered everywhere, roses and jasmine, lotus blossoms and lilies, filling the air with perfume that seemed to carry messages of love and desire. The approach to Tarsus was choreographed like a divine revelation. As the golden barge appeared on the horizon, its sails billowing purple against the azure sky, word spread through the city like wildfire. The goddess Aphrodite was coming to meet Dionysus, love was coming to claim power, and the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. The crowds that gathered along the riverbank were unlike any that had welcomed a visiting dignitary before. Romans who had come to see their commander receive the homage of an Eastern queen found themselves witnesses to something that transcended politics and entered the realm of pure theatre. This was not submission. This was seduction on a scale that made the very gods jealous. Mark Antony himself, waiting in his tribunal with all the majesty that Rome could command, felt the ground shift beneath his feet as the golden barge drew near. He had expected to receive a queen who would plead for her kingdom's safety, a woman who would offer tribute and seek protection. Instead, he found himself face to face with a vision that challenged every assumption he had made about power and its proper expression. When Cleopatra finally stepped onto the dock at Tarsus, the very air seemed to hold its breath. She moved with the grace of a goddess and the confidence of a woman who had never doubted her own worth. Her first words to Antony were not pleas or protests, but an invitation. She had come, she said, to celebrate with Dionysus the marriage of East and West, to feast with the god who understood that life's greatest pleasures were meant to be shared. The banquet that followed was like nothing Tarsus had ever seen. The golden barge had been transformed into a floating palace where Roman pragmatism met Egyptian luxury in combinations that dazzled the senses. The food was a fusion of cuisines that spoke of trade routes spanning continents. The wine flowed like rivers of liquid ruby, and the entertainment ranged from Egyptian dancers whose movements seemed to capture the very rhythm of the Nile, to Roman musicians whose melodies carried echoes of the eternal city. But it was the conversation between Antony and Cleopatra that truly mattered, the careful dance of two minds testing each other's strengths and weaknesses. He was drawn to her obvious intelligence, her command of languages and literature, her understanding of the complex currents of Eastern politics. She was intrigued by his military reputation, his reputation for loyalty to his friends, his vision of an Eastern empire that could rival anything Rome had created in the West. As the night deepened and the wine worked its ancient magic, the formal boundaries between Roman and Egyptian, between conqueror and queen, began to dissolve. They spoke of Alexander's dream of uniting East and West, of the possibilities that lay in combining Roman strength with Eastern wisdom, of the empire that could be built by two people who understood that power shared was power multiplied. When dawn finally broke over Tarsus, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, both Antony and Cleopatra understood that something momentous had occurred. This had been more than a diplomatic meeting. It had been the beginning of a partnership that could reshape the Mediterranean world. The golden barge of Aphrodite had carried more than a queen to her meeting with a Roman general. It had carried the seeds of an empire that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. But even as they celebrated their newfound alliance, the shadows of the future were already gathering. In Rome, Octavian watched the reports from the east with growing concern. His fellow triumvir was not just securing Egypt's cooperation, he was creating an alternative center of power that could challenge Rome's supremacy. The boy who had inherited Caesar's name was beginning to understand that he might need to fight for Caesar's empire. The meeting at Tarsus had achieved its purpose. Antony and Cleopatra had found in each other the partnership they both needed. But success, they were about to discover, could be even more dangerous than failure. The golden barge had carried them toward glory, but it was also carrying them toward a collision with destiny that would test not just their love, but their very survival. The waters of the Cydnus flowed on toward the sea, carrying with them the dreams and ambitions of those who dared to believe that love could be stronger than politics, that partnership could triumph over suspicion, and that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. In the Palace of Alexandria, where the morning light streamed through windows that had watched over the rise and fall of dynasties, two children played in gardens that had once known the footsteps of Alexander himself. They were beautiful children, these twins born to the Queen of Egypt and the Roman master of the East, a boy and a girl whose very existence seemed to promise a future where the boundaries between worlds might finally dissolve. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named for the sun and moon that ruled the heavens, had come into the world in the winter of 40 before Christ, when their parents' alliance was still young and full of promise. In their features, observers could trace the lineage of both parents, their mother's intelligence burning bright in dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, their father's strength evident in the determined set of their chins, the way they moved through the world as if they owned it by right of birth. The years following the meeting at Tarsus had been golden ones for both Egypt and its queen. Antony had proved to be not just a lover, but a true partner, understanding as Caesar had that Egypt's wealth was best preserved through cooperation rather than conquest. Together, they had created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a genuine partnership between Roman power and Egyptian wisdom that seemed to offer a new model for empire. Their love story had unfolded against a backdrop of magnificent spectacle and genuine achievement. When Antony visited Alexandria, he came not as a conqueror but as a collaborator, marveling at the intellectual treasures of the great library, consulting with Egyptian priests about the mysteries of their ancient religion, learning to see the world through eyes that had been shaped by 3 millennia of civilization. Cleopatra, for her part, had thrown herself into the role of Antony's Eastern partner with an energy that transformed the political landscape of the region. She accompanied him on campaigns, advised him on strategy, used Egypt's diplomatic network to strengthen their common cause. The queen, who had once hidden in a bundle of linens to reach Caesar, now stood openly beside Antony in the councils of war, her voice carrying weight that few women in the ancient world had ever achieved. But it was the birth of the twins that had truly sealed their partnership, creating bonds that transcended politics and entered the realm of dynasty. Alexander Helios, named for the great conqueror who had made the East bow to Western arms, was destined to rule Armenia and Media, vast kingdoms that Antony had conquered in their joint campaigns. Cleopatra Selene, bearing her mother's name and the title of the moon goddess, would inherit Cyrenaica and Crete, establishing Egyptian influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. In the nursery of the palace, where Egyptian and Roman tutors competed to shape young minds, the twins grew up speaking Greek and Latin with equal fluency, learning to read hieroglyphs and classical texts with the same ease. They were being prepared not just to rule, but to bridge worlds, to become the living embodiment of their parents' vision of a unified Eastern Empire. But even as these domestic joys flourished, the larger world was moving toward a confrontation that would test every alliance and destroy every dream that did not conform to Rome's singular vision of empire. In the West, Octavian had consolidated his position with a skill that would have made his adoptive father proud. He had eliminated Lepidus from the triumvirate, married his sister to Antony to strengthen their alliance, and then watched with calculating patience as his fellow triumvir became ever more deeply entangled with Egyptian royalty. The propaganda war that Octavian waged against Antony and Cleopatra was a masterpiece of political theater. He portrayed himself as the defender of Roman values against Eastern corruption, the champion of traditional virtue against foreign decadence. Every gift that Antony bestowed upon his Egyptian queen, every ceremony that acknowledged her divine status, every public display of their partnership was transformed by Octavian's skilled propagandists into evidence of treason and betrayal. The Romans, Octavian argued, had not conquered the Mediterranean world only to see it ruled from Alexandria by a woman who claimed descent from the pharaohs. The republic that had been founded on the rejection of kings would not tolerate the creation of a new monarchy that combined Roman strength with Egyptian mysticism. The choice, he insisted, was between Roman independence and Eastern slavery, between the virtues of their ancestors and the corruptions of foreign luxury. In Alexandria, as reports of Octavian's propaganda campaign reached them, Antony and Cleopatra began to understand that their golden years were drawing to a close. The world was not yet ready for their vision of partnership between East and West. The Romans, despite all their conquests, remained fundamentally suspicious of foreign influence, fundamentally committed to the idea that Rome must rule or Rome must fall. The final break came when Antony divorced Octavian's sister Octavia, formally ending the family alliance that had kept the triumvirate alive. The ceremony that followed, held in Alexandria's great stadium before a crowd of thousands, was designed to demonstrate that Antony had chosen Egypt over Rome, partnership over domination, love over politics. Standing before the assembled multitude, with Cleopatra beside him dressed as the goddess Isis, and the children arrayed around them like young gods, Antony proclaimed the donations of Alexandria, a redistribution of the eastern territories that acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's true heir, and established the twins as rulers of kingdoms that stretched from Armenia to Ethiopia. It was magnificent theatre, a spectacle worthy of the pharaohs at their height. But it was also a declaration of war against everything that Octavian represented. The boy who had inherited Caesar's name would not tolerate the existence of Caesar's alleged son, would not accept the division of Roman territories among Egyptian royalty, would not permit the creation of an alternative center of power that challenged Rome's supremacy. As word of the donations reached Rome, Octavian seized the moment he had been waiting for. He declared war not on Antony, who was still a Roman citizen and former triumvir, but on Cleopatra, the foreign queen who had allegedly bewitched their greatest general and corrupted him into betraying his Roman heritage. The final confrontation between East and West, between the old world and the new, between love and power, was about to begin. In the palace at Alexandria, as Cleopatra watched her children play in gardens that might soon echo with the sound of foreign armies, she knew that the golden years were ending. The twins who had been born to unite two worlds were about to become pawns in a struggle that would determine whether those worlds could coexist or whether one must utterly destroy the other. The Nile flowed on, carrying the dreams of queens and the ambitions of emperors toward a destiny that would be written in blood and sealed with the fall of the last independent kingdom in the Mediterranean world. The sea stretched before them like a field of liquid metal, its surface broken by the dark shapes of nearly 1,000 warships preparing for a battle that would determine the fate of the world. At Actium, where the Ambracian Gulf opened into the Ionian Sea, the forces of East and West faced each other across waters that seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of the carnage to come. On the morning of September 2nd, in the year 31 before Christ, Cleopatra stood on the deck of her flagship, the Antonias, watching as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the desert dawns of her homeland. Beside her, Mark Antony adjusted his armor with hands that showed only the slightest tremor, the accumulated tension of months of preparation and waiting finally finding release in the prospect of decisive action. Their fleet was magnificent, a gathering of ships that represented the naval might of half the Mediterranean world. Egyptian galleys with their graceful lines and battle-tested crews sailed alongside vessels from Syria and Asia Minor, from Phoenicia and Cyprus, from every corner of the Eastern Empire that had rallied to their cause. The ships themselves were works of art as much as instruments of war, their bronze rams gleaming in the morning light, their sails displaying the symbols of gods and goddesses who were believed to protect those who sailed beneath their banners. But magnificence and divine favor, Cleopatra knew, would not be enough to defeat the enemy that awaited them across the bay. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, represented everything that had made Rome the master of the Mediterranean: discipline, coordination, the ruthless efficiency that turned individual ships into components of a single deadly machine. The battle that was about to unfold had been years in the making, shaped by political miscalculations and personal ambitions that had transformed the Roman world into a killing ground. Antony and Cleopatra had chosen to make their stand at Actium, not from confidence but from necessity, their forces trapped by Octavian's superior strategy and forced to fight their way out of what had become an elegant prison. The months leading up to this moment had been a slow-motion catastrophe, as Octavian's forces systematically cut off their supplies and isolated them from their allies. Disease had ravaged their camps, desertion had thinned their ranks, and the confident army that had once seemed destined to march on Rome itself had withered like flowers in the desert sun. As the signal flags began to flutter from the masthead of Octavian's flagship, indicating the beginning of the attack, Cleopatra felt the weight of 3,000 years of Egyptian independence pressing upon her shoulders. This was more than a battle between rival Roman factions. This was the final test of whether the ancient world could preserve its independence against the homogenizing force of Roman Empire. The early phases of the battle unfolded with the terrible beauty of a deadly dance. The lighter Roman ships, built for speed and maneuverability, darted among the heavier eastern vessels like wolves among sheep, their bronze rams seeking the vulnerable points where a single well-placed blow could send a galley to the bottom. The sound of splintering wood and clashing bronze echoed across the water, punctuated by the screams of men who had discovered that death by drowning was neither quick nor glorious. Antony, commanding from the center of the line, fought with the desperate courage of a man who understood that defeat meant not just political failure, but personal annihilation. His ship, the massive Antonia, became the focal point of the battle as Roman vessels converged upon it like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The deck ran red with blood as Marines fought hand to hand, their swords and spears deciding the fate of empires in contests as personal as any duel. But it was Cleopatra who made the decision that would be remembered by history as either brilliant strategy or cowardly betrayal. As the battle reached its climax and the outcome began to tilt toward Octavian's forces, she ordered her squadron to break through the Roman line and escape toward the open sea. Her 60 ships, the fastest and most maneuverable in the Eastern Fleet, cut through the chaos like a sword through silk, carrying with them not just the Queen of Egypt, but the treasure that would be needed to continue the fight from new bases in the east. The sight of Cleopatra's retreat triggered a collapse that transformed defeat into catastrophe. Ships that had been fighting with desperate courage suddenly found themselves abandoned by their allies, their crews faced with the choice between dying for a lost cause or surrendering to enemies who had shown little mercy to those who opposed them. The Great Eastern Fleet, which had seemed so magnificent in the morning light, began to disintegrate like a sandcastle before the tide. Antony, faced with the impossible choice between honor and love, between dying gloriously with his men or living to fight another day with his queen, chose love. Abandoning his flagship and the men who had followed him faithfully for so many years, he transferred to a faster vessel and followed Cleopatra's fleet toward the horizon, leaving behind him a legacy that his enemies would use to blacken his name for centuries to come. The pursuit that followed was mercifully brief. Octavian's ships, heavy with the exhaustion of battle and burdened with prisoners and booty, could not match the speed of the Egyptian vessels that had been built for just such an escape. As the sun set over the Ionian Sea, painting the water in shades of blood and gold, the survivors of the Eastern cause sailed toward Alexandria and whatever refuge the ancient kingdom could provide. But even as they celebrated their escape from immediate destruction, both Antony and Cleopatra understood that Actium had been more than a military defeat. It had been the death of a dream. The vision of an Eastern empire that could stand as Rome's equal, the hope of a world where different civilizations could coexist as partners rather than as master and subject, had founded on the rocks of Roman determination and their own strategic miscalculations. Behind them, Octavian's victory at Actium was already being transformed by his propagandists into something more than a triumph over a rival faction. It was being presented as the salvation of Roman civilization from Eastern corruption, the vindication of traditional values against foreign decadence, the moment when the true heir of Caesar had proved his worthiness to rule the world. The ships that carried Antony and Cleopatra toward Alexandria were sailing not just across the Mediterranean, but across the boundary between hope and despair, between the world that might have been and the world that was about to be. The battle for the world had been fought and lost, and all that remained was to discover whether love could provide consolation for the failure of all their greatest ambitions. The sea that had witnessed the death of their dreams carried them homeward toward whatever final act awaited them in the land where their love had been born, and where perhaps it would also find its end. The palace at Alexandria had never seemed so quiet, its vast halls echoing with footsteps that carried the weight of impending doom. In the months following Actium, as Octavian's forces prepared for the final campaign that would end Egyptian independence forever, Cleopatra moved through her ancestral home like a ghost, haunting the scenes of her former glory. The great city that had once been the jewel of the Mediterranean world was slowly emptying as those who could fled to safety in distant lands. Ships departed daily from the harbor, carrying away the scholars and artists, the merchants and nobles who had made Alexandria the greatest center of learning and culture in the ancient world. The library, repository of human knowledge for centuries, began to feel like a tomb where wisdom waited to die. But Cleopatra refused to abandon the kingdom that had been her birthright and her burden. In the private chambers where she had once entertained Caesar and plotted with Antony, she now spent her days in pursuits that spoke of a mind preparing for eternity. She studied the ancient texts that dealt with death and the afterlife, consulted with priests about the proper rituals for ensuring safe passage to the realm of the gods, and tested various poisons to discover which would provide the most painless exit from a world that no longer had place for independent queens. Antony, once the master of the Roman East, had retreated into a melancholy that bordered on madness. The man who had commanded legions and conquered kingdoms now spent his days in a small building by the harbor, claiming, like Timon of Athens, to have found peace in misanthropy. The reports that reached him daily spoke of cities surrendering without resistance, of armies defecting to Octavian's cause, of a world that seemed eager to embrace the peace that only total submission could provide. Their children had been sent away to safety, scattered to various parts of the empire, where loyal allies might protect them from the vengeance that was sure to follow Octavian's victory. Caesarion, now 17 and bearing an unfortunate resemblance to his alleged father, had been dispatched toward India, with instructions to seek refuge in kingdoms beyond Rome's reach. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, had been hidden in secure locations where they might survive to carry forward the bloodline of their parents if fate proved kinder to the next generation. The final siege of Alexandria began in the summer of 30 before Christ, as Octavian's legions surrounded the city like a noose drawing tight around the neck of the ancient world. But this was to be no ordinary siege, no brutal sack that would add to Rome's reputation for ruthless efficiency. Octavian needed the wealth of Egypt intact, needed the kingdom to submit rather than resist, needed the granaries and treasuries preserved for the empire that he was building on the ruins of the Republic. The psychological warfare that preceded the assault was perhaps more devastating than any military campaign. Day after day, heralds approached the city walls with offers of clemency for those who would open the gates, with promises of mercy for those who would betray their queen, with threats of total destruction for those who continued to resist the inevitable triumph of Roman arms. Inside the palace, Cleopatra held court for the last time, receiving the handful of nobles and officials who had remained loyal to the end. The ceremonies that had once celebrated the power of the pharaohs now took on the character of funeral rites, as if the kingdom itself were already dead, and they were merely performing the rituals necessary to ensure its proper burial. It was during these final days that Cleopatra achieved perhaps her greatest triumph as a ruler, not through military victory or diplomatic success, but through the simple act of refusing to surrender her dignity in the face of certain defeat. While other monarchs might have fled or groveled for mercy, she prepared for death with the same meticulous attention to detail that she had once devoted to affairs of state. The asp that would carry her to the realm of the gods was selected with care, its venom tested to ensure that death would come swiftly and without the convulsions that might mar her final appearance. The costume she would wear for her last performance was chosen to invoke Isis, the mother goddess who had protected Egypt since the dawn of time, transforming her suicide into a religious ceremony that would echo through the ages. When news came that Antony had taken his own life, believing false reports of her death, Cleopatra felt the last chains that bound her to this world begin to loosen. The man who had shared her dreams of empire, who had given her children and partnership, and a love that had challenged the very foundations of Roman power, was gone. There was nothing left now but the final act of defiance that would ensure that her story ended on her own terms. The room where she chose to die was arranged like a stage set for the greatest drama ever performed. Golden treasures that had adorned the tombs of pharaohs surrounded her couch, while servants dressed as priestesses burned incense that carried prayers to gods who had ruled Egypt for millennia. When Octavian's soldiers finally broke down the doors, They found not a defeated queen cowering in fear, but a woman who had transformed her death into a work of art. The asp, hidden among the figs that had been her final meal, had done its work with merciful efficiency. Cleopatra lay upon her golden couch as if she were merely sleeping, her beauty unmarred by the struggles that had consumed her final years. Beside her, two of her most faithful servants had chosen to follow their queen into death, creating a tableau that spoke of loyalty that transcended even the grave. For Octavian, arriving too late to prevent the suicide that would deprive him of his greatest trophy, the sight was both frustrating and oddly moving. He had planned to parade the Queen of Egypt through the streets of Rome, to display her as proof of his victory over the forces that had threatened Roman supremacy. Instead, he found himself faced with a woman who had managed to defeat him through the simple expedient of choosing death over dishonor. The Kingdom of Egypt died with its last pharaoh, becoming merely another province in an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. The language of the hieroglyphs would be forgotten, the ancient religion would give way to newer gods, and the Nile would flow under Roman rule for centuries to come. But the story that had ended in Alexandria would live forever, carried forward by poets and historians who understood that some defeats were more glorious than victory, that some loves were too great to be contained by the boundaries of empires, that some dreams were worth dying for, even when they could never be achieved. The last queen of Egypt had chosen to become a legend rather than a captive, and in that choice she had won a victory that even Octavian's legions could not take away. The asp that had carried her to eternity had also carried her story into the realm of myth, where it would inspire lovers and dreamers for as long as humanity remembered the woman who had dared to believe that love could conquer the world. In the silence that followed her death, the palace at Alexandria seemed to exhale one final breath, as if the very stones were mourning the end of an age that would never come again. The Nile flows on, as it always has, as it always will, carrying with it the memories of those who dared to dream that love could be stronger than empires, that beauty could triumph over brutality, that one woman's courage could challenge the very foundations of the world. In the years since Cleopatra's death, the river has watched empires rise and fall, has seen conquerors come and go like shadows across the sand, has carried the hopes and dreams of countless generations toward the eternal sea. But tonight, in the quiet hours when the world sleeps and dreams, the spirit of the last queen seems to move once more along the ancient waters. Listen. Can you hear the gentle splash of oars against the current, the whisper of silk sails filling with the desert wind? Can you see the glimmer of gold in the moonlight, the shadow of a barge that carries more than memory through the darkness? She is there, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, beloved of Isis, the woman who loved Caesar and Antony, who bore children to bridge the gap between East and West, who chose death over dishonor, and in dying, achieved a kind of immortality that no conqueror could ever claim. The tourists who visit Egypt today, wandering through the ruins of temples and palaces that once echoed with her footsteps, sometimes report strange experiences. A fragrance of jasmine where no flowers bloom, the sound of distant music carried on the wind, the feeling of being watched by eyes that have seen the rise and fall of civilizations. The guides smile and speak of imagination, of the desert playing tricks on foreign minds, but they know better. They know that some presences are too powerful to be contained by death, too magnificent to be limited by the boundaries of flesh and bone. In Alexandria, where the lighthouse once stood as a beacon between earth and heaven, fishermen sometimes tell stories of a woman seen walking on the water in the hour before dawn. She appears, they say, when the mist rises from the harbor and the world holds its breath between night and day. Beautiful beyond description, wearing robes that shimmer like scales in the uncertain light, she moves across the waves as if they were solid ground, her dark eyes searching always for something lost, something that can never be found again. The scholars dismiss such tales as folklore, the product of minds that need magic to make sense of a world that has forgotten how to believe in wonders. But late at night, when they are alone with their books and their calculations, Some of them pause in their work and listen to the wind that comes off the water. And sometimes, just sometimes, they hear in that wind the echo of a voice that once commanded pharaohs and charmed emperors, a voice that spoke 9 languages and understood the secrets of gods and mortals alike. For Cleopatra's story is more than history. It is the eternal tale of those who dare to love completely, who refuse to accept the limitations that the world would place upon their dreams, who choose to burn brightly rather than fade quietly into the darkness. In every age, in every land, there are those who recognize themselves in her story, who see in her courage a reflection of their own deepest longings, who find in her tragedy a kind of triumph that transcends the mere facts of victory and defeat. The children she bore, Caesarion, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, little Ptolemy Philadelphus, scattered to the winds by Octavian's vengeance, have become symbols of possibilities lost, of futures that might have been if the world had been ready for the vision she represented. Some say Caesarion escaped to India and founded a kingdom that lasted for centuries. Others claim that the twins survived in hiding, their bloodline continuing in secret, carrying forward the dream of a world where different cultures could meet as equals rather than as master and subject. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more profound than any of these legends. Perhaps Cleopatra's real children are not those who shared her blood, but those who shared her vision. The artists and dreamers, the lovers and rebels, the men and women in every generation who refuse to accept that the world must be divided into conquerors and conquered, who believe that beauty and wisdom are forces as powerful as any army, who understand that some defeats are more glorious than victory. In the quiet museums where her image is preserved in marble and bronze, in the libraries where her story is told in dozens of languages, in the theaters where her tragedy is performed for audiences who gasp at her courage and weep at her fate, Cleopatra lives on. She lives in every woman who refuses to be limited by others' expectations, in every love that dares to challenge the established order, in every dream of a world where different peoples can meet as partners rather than as enemies. The Nile remembers everything. It remembers the child who stood on palace balconies and dreamed of greatness, the young queen who hid in a bundle of linens to reach Caesar's chambers, the woman who sailed to Tarsus dressed as Aphrodite to enchant Mark Antony, the mother who sent her children away to safety, the pharaoh who chose death over dishonor when the world no longer had room for independent queens. And on certain nights, when the moon is full and the desert wind carries the scent of jasmine and myrrh, when the boundaries between past and present grow thin and the eternal seems to touch the temporal, the river sings her story to those who have ears to hear. It sings of love that challenged empires, of beauty that defied time, of courage that transformed defeat into legend. For Cleopatra is eternal now, as eternal as the Nile itself, flowing through the consciousness of humanity like water through the desert, bringing life and hope and the promise that somewhere, somehow, love will always find a way to triumph over the forces that would divide and diminish us. Listen. Can you hear her voice in the whisper of the wind, in the gentle lapping of water against ancient stones? She is calling to you across the centuries, reminding you that you too carry within yourself the seeds of greatness, the capacity for love that transcends boundaries, the courage to dream dreams that can reshape the world. Sleep now and let her story carry you into dreams where anything is possible, where love conquers all, where the last queen of Egypt still sails upon the eternal waters of the Nile, beautiful and terrible and magnificent, forever and always, world without end. The river flows on, carrying her memory toward the infinite sea, where all stories end and all stories begin, where the last queen of the Nile reigns eternal in the kingdom of dreams. Thus ends the tale of Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, whose love challenged empires and whose memory flows eternal through the stream of human consciousness, reminding us always that some spirits are too magnificent to be contained by death, too powerful to be forgotten by time,